All right, so hey everyone, my name is Michael Lustgarten, and today we're going to go through my data-driven, personalized approach for optimal health and potentially longevity. And this is a small snapshot of what I do. I post weekly videos, sometimes, most of the time, more than once a week. So if you want more, if you want to see more, that's my site, Conquer Aging or Die Trying. So risk of death increases as chronological age increases, and that's what we'll see here. So on the y-axis, we've got death rates plotted against age from birth until 95 years. And you can see that death rates are very high for newborns, after which mortality rates decline rapidly until we're about 10 to 14 years old. And then you can see that mortality risk increases pretty close to linearly for every year that we're alive after that. So the big idea, or the idea that I'm interested in, is what if we could flatten mortality risk? Instead of seeing that linear increase over time, what if we could flatten it and keep it relatively low for as long as we physically can? Could we optimize health and potentially lifespan in doing so? So then the big question is how? So aging and disease are biochemical processes that happen over many decades. It's not something that just happens out of nowhere. You don't just wake up one day in your age. It's a biochemical process that's been happening for a very long time. So if we track and optimize, or attempt to optimize, well-established biomarkers of organ and systemic function, can aging and disease risk be slowed? So that's my central premise. I say it almost in every video, but that's the root of the deal. So then what should we track? And I'm not going to go into everything here. I'm just going to keep it tight. I could go on and on about what we should track, but the foundation of it is trying to track as many biomarkers of as many organs and systemic function as possible, and trying to keep it as youthful as possible. So defining what youthful data looks like, and data that's associated with reduced risk of death for all causes. So keeping it in that space for as long as physically possible, and then can we flatten mortality risk and optimize our health and lifespan as a consequence of that. So one example that potentially extends lifespan is young blood. And so I should say that my goal isn't just focusing on optimizing blood biomarkers. There's a hierarchy to this, and at the top of that hierarchy is physical and cognitive function, body composition, so muscle mass, visceral fat, bone density. These are things that change during aging and not for the better. And then we can subdivide that into what's under the hood. So blood biomarkers are one aspect of what's under the hood, but then we can further subdivide that into cells, protein, metabolites, epigenetics, and I'm tracking portions of each of those stages. So young blood, so it extends lifespan in old mice. How do we know that? So in this study, prolonged heterochronic parabiosis decreased biological age and promoted longevity. So then the obvious question should be, what is heterochronic parabiosis? So that's when two animals are surgically connected, their bloodstreams are surgically connected, so these animals basically share a blood supply for their duration of their lifespan, and in this case, old attached to young. So what was the effect on lifespan? So on the y-axis, we've got percent survival, plotted against age in weeks, and then in terms of median survival, we look at 50% survival. That's when half of the mice were alive and half had died. And relative to two control groups, the old mice that had a blood supply that was surgically connected to a young mice for the duration of their lifespan had a significant extension in median lifespan. So that shows that young blood has some factors in it that can extend the lifespan of old mice, but it doesn't tell us which blood factors might be responsible. So evidence for that comes from a different study, and this is pretty recently published last month, where fasting and the combination of calorie restriction, CR, and fasting extended lifespan. So there were 5 groups in this study. Ad lib, they ate as much as they wanted, and these are female mice, and it's a very large study. It was 960 mice in total, 192 per group. And then 1 day of fasting, 2 days of fasting, 20% CR, 40% calorie restriction. In terms of lifespan, we go to that 0.5% survival, that's median survival. And then for both fasting groups, we see an increase in median survival. Calorie restriction, 20% did better, but then the best of the bunch was 40% CR. So this shouldn't be a surprise. This has been shown in other studies. But what's interesting about this study is that many mice live past 36 months. So the median lifespan in the 40% CR group was 36 months. But you can see that there were even mice in the ad lib group who lived past 36 months, and other groups too, not just the CR groups. So the authors of this study asked what might contribute to a longer lifespan, at least in mice, independent of group assignment. So that's what we can see here, and I'm only going to focus on a couple of the biomarkers that are here. I mean, we can do a deep dive into all of them, but The two that I'm focused on here are lymphocytes, which are a type of white blood cell. So white blood cells are not a homogeneous group. They're comprised of generally pro-inflammatory neutrophils and monocytes and lymphocytes, which also are a part of the immune system. So having relatively higher levels of lymphocytes when the mice were 16 months of age was significantly correlated with a longer longevity, or with longevity, independent of which group that the mice were in. So it didn't matter if they were 20% CR or in ad lib. If they had higher levels of lymphocytes at 16 months, they were more likely to have an extended longevity and live past 36 months. On the other hand, the RDW, so the red blood cell distribution width, which is a measure of the variability in the size of your red blood cells. So red blood cells when you're young are very small, and during aging they increase. So the RDW is a measure of, do you have lots of small red blood cells, or do you have a mix of small and large, which is more variable relative to having all small red blood cells. So having a higher RDW was significantly correlated with a shorter lifespan, and again, that's independent of which group. So even mice that were 40% CR, if they had a higher RDW, they lived shorter relative to other 40% CR mice that had a lower RDW. Now, where this story gets interesting is that this pattern is also found in humans. It's not just in long-lived mice. So the RDW increases during aging, and that's what we'll see here. So RDW on the y-axis plotted against age, and we can see that age-related increase. And the importance of the RDW increase during aging in people is that relatively higher levels are associated with an increased risk of death for all causes. So as I mentioned at the beginning, this is my data-driven, personalized approach for optimizing health and potentially lifespan. So what's my data? So I've been tracking not just the RDW, but the standard chemistry panel and CBC, which is about 25 to 30 biomarkers that represent many different organ systems, metabolic health, inflammation, etc. So I've tracked for the past 10 years, as you can see, I've got 51 blood tests, which is an average of 5 per year, but I've since bumped it up to 8, and I'll probably continue doing 8 blood tests a year for going forward indefinitely. So in terms of RDW versus chronological age, that's what we've got here. And then we can see that there's a significant inverse correlation for the RDW with my chronological age. So in other words, I've resisted or reversed the age-related RDW increase. So in the longevity space, there's a lot of hype and there's a lot of over-exaggeration, and this is, I guess, kind of the point where I could say, hey, I've reversed this aspect of aging in superlatives, right? But I don't see it like that at all. This is just one biomarker, and the fact is, I can't control what happened for the first 40 years. What I have done is, though, potentially slowed mechanisms that may be related to a shorter lifespan and potentially worse health with a higher RDW, in association with a higher RDW. All I can do for now, though, is try to maintain that at relatively low levels indefinitely. And if I can do that, going back to the central premise, can I flatten my mortality risk using the same approach not just for the RDW, but for all biomarkers? All right, so that was one biomarker. What about lymphocytes? As we saw that they are significantly correlated with a longer lifespan, at least in the mice. So here, too, the data is similar in people and in the long-lived mice. So lymphocytes decline during aging, with lymphocytes on the y-axis plotted against age, and then we can see that age-related decline. So in youth, average values around 2,000 are more likely to be found. And that's important because the age-related decline for lymphocytes is associated with an increased risk of death for all causes. So, which then brings us to what's my data? Again, over those 51 tests, so now we're looking at lymphocytes plotted against age, and unfortunately we can see an age-related decline. So, I can't, I could easily show one biomarker and say, hey, I'm kicking ass everywhere, but the fact is, this data shows that I've succumbed to some age-related decline. Whereas I prefer for it to be flatlined over time, right? To try to keep that mortality risk potentially flatlined for the duration of my lifespan. So then the big question is, can I get it to on that flatline level? And then the big question is then, what's the approach? How can I get it back there? How can I reverse or try to reverse this age-related change? So in terms of the approach, I've weighed all my food, and it just doesn't apply to food. This applies to fitness metrics, sleep, days I've worked out. I mean, I'm tracking basically everything, but I'm only going to focus on food for now. So weighed everything with a food scale since 2015, entered that into Chronometer, which is a diet tracking app, and then I take that data and I put it in a spreadsheet. So I've got macros, micros, individual foods. So then each blood test has a corresponding average dietary intake. So if there's 50 days in between blood tests, because I'm tracking everything in diet, I can take the average dietary intake over that period and line it up with the latter blood test. So now every blood test has a bunch of dietary and other biomarkers that I can run correlations on, and I can see how much fat, how much protein, how much fiber, micronutrients, supplements, what may be optimal for optimizing my biomarkers towards the most useful values that they can possibly be. So then I calculate those correlations, I try to follow as many as possible, which then brings us back to what can I do to potentially increase those lymphocytes. So I don't have time to go through all of the factors that are associated with higher, correlated with higher lymphocytes, but one factor in my data is calorie intake, which is what we can see here, with lymphocytes plotted against the average daily calorie intake over those 51 tests. So each dot corresponds to the average dietary calorie intake from test to test. And then we can see that significant correlation. So that suggests that in order to flatline the lymphocytes at relatively youthful levels and resist that age-related change, that I should potentially increase my calories somewhere up to around 2,800 based on extrapolation of that trend line. However, more recently, I'm around 2,100, and that's on purpose because calorie restriction may improve more of my biomarkers relative to others. So then that raises the question, so what calorie intake might be best for lymphocytes, knowing that my most recent data, I had 3 that were pretty bad and are probably pulling the correlation down, making my lymphocytes look more aged and following that age-related trajectory. But what calorie intake may be best for the lymphocytes without messing up other biomarkers? And that's important to say because it's easy for me to just focus on 1 or 2 or 3 biomarkers, but my goal is to optimize everything across the board. It's not just one organ system or one aspect of health. It's do an intervention and what does it look like across the board, and then is the net effect actually positive for the sum of those biomarkers, neutral or detrimental, and then I course correct based on that. So a higher calorie intake in my case, which is one argument against going too high for calorie intake with increasing lymphocytes, is significantly correlated with a lot more biomarkers going in the wrong direction than right. So as I mentioned, I tracked that panel of about 25 to 30 biomarkers on the standard chemistry panel in CBC, and these are just the ones. The little r is the correlation coefficient, and then the p-value is the correlation for calorie intake with each of these biomarkers. So almost half of those 25 biomarkers of organ and systemic function are significantly correlated with these biomarkers going in the wrong direction in terms of how they look in the youthful state versus age and their associations with all-cause mortality risk. So just to highlight a couple, RDW in this case, you can see the correlation is positive. So in my case, a higher calorie intake is significantly correlated with a higher RDW, and that may be one factor how I've been able to reduce that RDW to now youthful levels. So if I increase calories, I may improve my lymphocytes, but on the other hand, make my RDW worse. So it's about finding the bottom of that U-shaped curve so that I can, minimize risk. And then, we can see one other on the list because Nick's in the crowd. We can see that LDL, in my case, higher calories are significantly correlated with higher LDL, which I've got going in the wrong direction for now, but I'm open to the idea that a little bit higher than where I am may be actually good for health. So, but that's a story for another day. So to answer the question, what calorie intake may be best for lymphocytes, these data collectively would suggest that not 2080, which is my lowest that corresponds to a blood test over the past 10 years, but for now I'm at about 2150, and that's intentionally done. And one reason for that is 2 blood tests ago, lymphocytes were close to 1900, and a blood tested on Friday, it was also close to 1900. So I may be slowing that age-related decline and getting my data back to where youthful values are supposed to be. So that's what I got. That's all I got for now. More on the channel. Check it out if you're interested.
Right. For Mike, we'll do 2 quick questions. If anybody has any. David.
It's great to hear you talk in person, Mike. For those who don't know, he has a YouTube channel, and I just want to commend individuals who are interested in taking concrete steps to improve their health. And so it's a question of data. How do we optimize the use of data, which is really tricky at n = 1 level. So to my question, and I'm keeping it broad because I kind of have an answer, but I'm having you steer in terms of the answer. Can you comment about your use of a Pearson's or other correlation coefficient versus multiple regression, the role for potential confounding, and maybe you can educate the audience a little bit?
Yeah, it's a great point. So for the most part, I focus on, you could even talk about like false discovery rate, right? So, yeah, so, and when you have, just using a p-value of less than 0.05, you're going to have 5 false positive correlations out of 100, right? So even though I published using FDR in very large sample sizes, I'm trying not to throw away any data. I'm looking for gross patterns in the data, and rather than exclude something statistically, I can directly test the correlation. So for example, if cocoa beans are associated with lower lipoprotein A, if I increase cocoa beans and my lipoprotein A doesn't change, then it had nothing to do with it, right? the correlation will weaken over time, and then I'll see other stuff pop up in the correlation list, and I'll continue to follow that. Eventually, it's a matter of data collection. It's how many tests do I have to do where now the story becomes evident, and it looks like the real, that's the real story. So yeah, that's part of it. The other aspect of it too is, adjusting the models for, some of this may be driven by body weight and calorie intake. So if I'm looking at individual associations between, say, I don't know, fat intake with a panel of biomarkers, if it's significant and unadjusted, just a straight correlation, but then knowing it may be also associated with body weight and calorie intake, then I'll adjust the models in that case to try to dig deeper. But I'm doing this basically, one linear regression model at a time. I don't have coding experience. I am working with some coders to build an app to do that, and that's the future of this, which makes it a lot easier to do. But you can go very far just using unadjusted correlations and just that constant iteration, test after test.
And I do know you try to control, at least from one data set to the next, as much as possible in the experiment. So thank you, Mike.
All right, any other questions? Let's do Gunya.
Thank you for the talk first. I'm curious, I know you're doing it on yourself. I'm curious if you know maybe about the research around women and longevity, because obviously women have a very specific cycle that they go throughout their lives, and then it changes both with pregnancy, if they get pregnant, and then any kind of things like post-pregnancy, menopause, or in between. So I'm curious how that correlates with all this research, because I assume a cyclical body has a different potentially relationship to longevity with all these markers.
Yeah, for some things there are sex-independent effects. So for example, RDW, basically on the plot, you can see that it's increasing during aging no matter if you're a man or a woman, but your point is definitely well taken. For example, there are things like immune cells, which are biphasic during aging for women only. For men, it's pretty close to linearly where it increases. But it can be, but even then too, it's at which point in the cycle are you measuring, right? So I think standardization is important. So if you're trying to track your own biomarkers as a woman over time, do you track 2 weeks after your cycle hits? Do you track, so it's trying to standardize that over time so you've got consistent data. It's 1 week from the cycle, 2 weeks from the cycle, 3 weeks from the cycle, and then separating your data, looking at it like that. So standardization is a big part of it, but yeah, there are definitely sex-independent effects that are pretty similar across men and women. But then there are other things that are not. But tracking is the only way to find out, I'd say. So.
How would you approach situation if you have one outlier? Say you have, instead of usual distribution, one biomarker is pretty bad. Say red blood distribution is really bad and everything else is it as, how would you
think about that's a great point too. I try not to throw away any data, even the outliers. And the outliers could be, I've found something that I don't yet know if it's true or not. So if I throw it out, maybe I've thrown away a novel hypothesis. For example, a very high dose nicotinic acid increased my NAD, which isn't a surprise. Niacin increases NAD. But another biomarker, Dunedin pace, which is an epigenetic speed of aging, it sent it to its worst data that I've ever had. And if you do like the stats on 3 standard deviations from the average, it's clearly an outlier. But that's actually insight into some other processes that I've tested since then to try to figure out what was going on there. So I don't throw away any data. I try to use that as the outliers, preliminary data for a mechanism that I haven't yet discovered.
So it's basically a cause of concern, but no.
Could be, or the other side of it too, where I've actually stumbled on something that may be beneficial.
I just wanted to ask about lymphocyte production and whatnot, like in the thymus and the bone marrow. Have you looked at ways of preserving that? Because I do know that decreases with age and whatnot. And thymus, in kids, it's very large, but in adults, it's much smaller. It's like a piece of fat right here almost, and it secretes hormones that help it.
Yeah, so I haven't looked that deeply into it, but I'm basically looking at the end products, right? So I can't presume to track the thymus function or thymus gland size over time. I mean, I'd have to probably get, ultrasound to see, right? But if I can look at the end products, whether it's specific immune cells and how they change during aging, and then if I have the recipe, whether it's diet, supplements, exercise, fitness, sleep, whatever it may be, or some senolytic or geoprotector, that I can look at the endpoints. Now, is that because I'm improving some aspect of thymus function or some aspect of overall systemic physiology where I'm, reducing lymphocyte degradation or prolonging their lifespan? I don't know. So I'm basically looking at the end products. And indirectly, there may be some, slowing of thymus degeneration over time, but I haven't studied it. I haven't studied that.
We've got time for one more question. Kurt?
Kurt, you have one question?
Sure, I have two questions. So I noticed you were measuring the red blood cell distribution, but then you said that the size also matters. So did you measure absolute size?
Yeah, MCV, that's the mean corpuscular volume. Yeah, that's one of the biomarkers that I track. Lately, they've been trending upward and going in the wrong direction. So, but I'm trying some things, based on the correlations to try to bring them back to my most youthful data.
Okay, the second question was just practical. You said you measured since 2015 all of your meals.
Yeah.
How do you do that at the restaurant? Like, do you bring a scale with you? And how does that
Yeah,
work?
so I generally don't eat out.
Generally, for 10 years, or?
Yeah. If I do, it's I'll ballpark. First of all, it's very rare, but if I do, I'll ballpark the calories. But it's such an infrequent event that if I've got a 50-day period in between blood tests, and one of the days I ate out somewhere and I ate something that I don't exactly know what it is in terms of calories, and when you think about that in the sphere of 50 other days where it's completely tracked, it's like a dime in a dozen dimes or more, right? So, yeah.
Thank you.
All right.